Hi, I'm Ben Armstrong, Principal Program Manager Lead at Microsoft, working on the Platform Virtualization team. Today I'm here to talk to you about Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI. But before I get started, let me just remind you all about the Azure hybrid strategy. And this is where we here at Microsoft have been working for the last couple of years to deliver technology that can run just as easily in Azure as it can in your data center and in your places of business and frankly wherever you need it to run. We've also been working on bringing this all together in a unified management plane under Azure Arc, because we believe that there is real power in being able to build your applications and then being able to run them where they need to run without having to rewrite them or make huge learning or reinvestments. And in doing this, we've been investing in a whole lot of technologies. One of them is Azure Kubernetes Service. This is something that we brought to market a little while ago. It runs in Azure, and it provides a Kubernetes platform that you can use to run your container applications in production style. Now, Azure Kubernetes Service takes the existing open source technology of Kubernetes. It applies the best practices and puts them built in. It uses multi-layer security and combines it with great enterprise support, so that you can then take your applications and run them easily. We also give you a unified management experience to try and make it as seamless and easy as possible. But with this, we've been chatting to all of you, and you've been talking to us about a couple of different things. The first thing that we've been hearing from you all is, hey, I really like AKS. I've written some apps for it, but I want to be able to take those apps and I want to be able to run them in my data center without having to make a whole bunch of changes. Another conversation that we've been hearing is like, hey, this hybrid cloud story is really interesting, but I'm worried that in order to do it, I'm going to have to double my staff to be able to run all the infrastructure, and that wouldn't be good. And the third conversation that we've been hearing is, yes, I'm interested in the hybrid cloud model and thinking about cloud native applications. However, I also have a lot of existing applications that I can't just throw out. I need to keep them running. They're important to my business. And I also need to figure out how to modernize those applications and bring them forward. And so with all of these conversations, that's what led us to building Azure Kubernetes Service for Azure Stack HCI. So what is Azure Kubernetes Service for Azure Stack HCI? Well, the name is pretty descriptive. It's where we are taking all the technology from Azure Kubernetes Service and giving you the ability to run it in your data center on top of Azure Stack HCI. And in doing this, there are a couple of things that we think are really interesting and important for you to be aware of. The first is that it is easy to deploy and easy to use. The second is that it is hybrid by design. It is AKS in your data center. It has the ability to run Linux and Windows containers, and it comes with great built-in security. So let's dig into each of these items and talk about them in a bit more detail. So first, let's talk about easy to deploy and easy to use. So Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI is a fully inclusive Kubernetes offering. It has everything that you need to be able to take your containerized applications and run them in production today. And of course, it's based on industry-proven open source technology. But on top of that, it is very easy to deploy. We've built deployment experiences using both Windows Admin Center and PowerShell, so that if you're familiar with Azure Stack HCI or Windows Server, you're going to find it very easy to get up and running with Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI. With that in mind, let's go across to Amber, who's going to show us exactly what it looks like to deploy Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Amber Guo, the Program Manager working on the Windows Admin Center deploy experience for AKS HCI. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to create an AKS cluster on Azure Stack HCI via Windows Admin Center, and then how to view your cluster on the Azure portal via Azure Arc. We will first start by creating an AKS host on Azure Stack HCI. For this demo, I have a pre-configured Azure Stack HCI cluster created via the new Azure Stack HCI workflow in Windows Admin Center. To kick off a host setup, I'm going to navigate into the cluster connection and click on the AKS tool. There are several prerequisites which are validated by the system checks page. AKS host configuration allows for changes to networking and storage parameters. Azure registration is required for Azure services and support. After review and create, the status page provides updates and a way to download the host credentials once the setup is complete. To create a Kubernetes cluster on the newly set up AKS host, navigate back to the connections page. Notice that the Kubernetes cluster create experience in Windows Admin Center is similar to the AKS experience on the Azure portal. This is to provide a consistent experience for deploying in Azure and on-premise. To create an AKS cluster, enter your Azure Arc connection details, cluster and host information, and primary node pool specifications. Workload node pools can be added on the node pools page. In the networking step, select Advanced Networking for more configuration options or default to basic. Integrations allow you to enable different experiences and enhancements for the cluster. Once done, progress to review and create the cluster. After a few minutes for cluster creation, click on the link to navigate to the Arc connected cluster in the Azure portal. You can see the cluster details like Kubernetes version and node count. As you can see, AKS HCI is easy to set up and use via Windows Admin Center and Azure Arc. Back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Amber. It's great to see just how easy it is to get up and running with Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI. Now, the next topic to talk about is hybrid by design. So with Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI, we are literally taking Azure Kubernetes Service and providing it to you. Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI share the same upstream code repository. And as much as possible, we try to reuse the same code. Now, there are obvious differences because we don't have the rest of Azure around us when we're running in your data center. But in doing this, this means that, one, we're able to provide a high guarantee around application compatibility so that you can move your applications between the two environments. But just as importantly, we've been working to make sure that we have a consistent user experience so that if you learn to use Azure Kubernetes Service first, all that learning just goes across to Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI, or vice versa. If you start learning in your data center, when it comes time to move to the public cloud, you're going to feel right at home. And the final thing to call out is that as you use Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI, it natively integrates with all the great Azure technologies like Azure Arc, Azure Monitor, Azure Policy. And finally, it is sold as a service, just like Azure Kubernetes Service is. So you don't have to pay a big fee up front. Instead, you just pay for it as you use it, like any other cloud service. Now, with all of that said, let's go across to Abhilasha, who's going to show us what this Azure integration looks like for you as the user.
Thank you, Ben. I'm Abhilasha, a program manager for the AKS HCI team at Microsoft. Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI is for customers who want to run AKS-style workloads on-premise. By connecting your on-premise clusters to Azure Arc, you can easily deploy these AKS workloads. You can also enjoy Azure services like Azure Monitor and Azure Policy seamlessly. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to deploy an AKS workload on Azure Stack HCI using Azure Arc. I'm then going to show you how to use Azure Monitor and then Azure Policy on your on-premise cluster. We will start where Amber left off. As you can see on the screen, I have an AKS HCI cluster onboarded to the Azure portal using Windows Admin Center. Here, you can see cluster details like Kubernetes version and cluster node count. We will now try deploying an app on top of this cluster. To deploy an application, you first have to create a source control configuration. A source control configuration contains the link to your GitHub repository. The Git repository in itself can contain Kubernetes resources such as namespaces and deployments. Go to Configurations and click on Add. We will give this configuration a name and instruct the agent to deploy the operator in the cluster config namespace. We will give the operator cluster admin permissions and input the GitHub repository URL. Once the configuration has been added, wait for the operator state to turn green. You can then navigate to your on-premise target cluster and run a simple kubectl command to get the load balancer's external IP address. Using this IP address, you can see your deployed application. Now that you've successfully deployed an application, it's time to monitor it. Navigate back to the Azure portal and click on Insights under Monitoring. Using Azure Monitor, you can monitor metrics like node CPU utilization and memory utilization as seen on the screen. To use Azure Policy, on your left pane, click on Policies. Using Azure Policy, you can report the compliance state of your Kubernetes cluster. As you've seen on this demo, AKS HCI is hybrid by design. It is integrated natively with Azure Arc, making it super easy to manage a cluster from Azure, deploy apps through GitOps, and extend Azure services like Monitor and Policy. So at the end of the day, you can concentrate on what matters most, your applications. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Abhilasha. It's really cool to see the sort of power that you get by being integrated into Azure and how much easier it makes to manage these environments. So the next topic to discuss for Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI is the fact that it can run both Linux containers and Windows containers out of the box. And a key detail to understand here is that all of this infrastructure is managed for you. When we say it can run Linux containers, that doesn't mean that there's a bunch of work that you have to do to manage a Linux environment. No, you just deploy Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI, and everything is there for you to be able to run Linux containers, and all the necessary infrastructure is automatically managed and kept up to date and secure for you by Microsoft. Same story for Windows. Where once again, you don't have to worry about the details of all the infrastructure needed to run Windows containers. We handle that for you. You just focus on your applications. And all of this comes with a simple single support statement and a single vendor to talk to if you encounter any problems or need any assistance. And this is really important because as we've been talking to people, a lot of people have great experience with Linux or great experience with Windows and feel really comfortable in those environments. But it's not very common to find people where they are equally comfortable in both environments. So we wanted to create a platform that could run both and, let you focus on your applications, not on understanding all the operating system details of the infrastructure. So having said that, let's go across to Muzz, who's going to show us what this looks like in action.
Thanks, Ben. And hello, everyone. I'm Muzz Imam. I'm a PM on Containers Platform team. I focus on Windows containers and Kubernetes. Today, I'm going to show you how simple it is to deploy Linux and Windows applications side by side on AKS HCI cluster. I'm going to go through 3 simple steps. Step number 1, I'm going to modernize my existing legacy Windows application called iBuySpy. Step number 2, I'm going to deploy a very popular Linux app called Nginx Ingress Controller, which is basically a gateway or a router. And step number 3, I'm going to connect the two so the traffic coming to the Nginx controller is going to get routed to the Windows application. So to get started, I'm going to get the code from GitHub for iBuySpy, and I'm going to containerize it. Once I'm done, next step is to create a Kubernetes manifest file. I grabbed a sample from this tutorial for AKS, and I tweaked it to make it work for iBuySpy. Once I have that, I can use kubectl using PowerShell to deploy this Windows application. And once that's deployed, I can quickly grab the IP, the external IP, so I can go to the application. And I go to the browser, and I go to the application, and it's working. Great, step 1 finished. Now I'm going to install the Nginx Ingress Controller. To do that, I'm going to first create a namespace for my Linux application. And then I'm going to use this popular Helm tool to install the Nginx Ingress Controller so I don't have to do all the configuration myself. And this is done. Now we're done with step 2. The last step is to connect the two. So we go back to our YAML file and we add an ingress controller route that defines that if anything is coming to the Nginx controller routed by default to Windows application. Once that's added, I'll save it, and then I will deploy the same YAML one more time. And that's deployed. Now let's look at the IP address of the Nginx ingress controller so I can go and see if it's working. So this is working. So now if I go to this IP, it should route me to my Windows application. So let's go and take a look. And it is working. That's how simple it is to deploy Linux and Windows applications side by side and use the modern tools that come with Kubernetes on AKS HCI. With that, back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Maz. I'm really looking forward to seeing the applications that people run on Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI. And I'll be interested to see how they use the platform to help them modernize applications and move towards a more cloud-native world. But the final topic to talk about is security. Now, I've already talked a little bit about the fact that we have Linux and Windows environments that we're managing for you. But more than that, Kubernetes is a very complicated piece of technology that has a lot of moving pieces. You have a control plane, you have worker nodes for Linux and worker nodes for Windows containers, and you have a lot of infrastructure involved. A core part of our security story is that we manage that all for you. We provide a set of images which are hardened against vulnerabilities by Microsoft, and we then update them and patch them automatically for you to ensure that you're always protected. Beyond that, we're currently making investments to further harden the core Kubernetes offering that we're providing. Two key investments that we're working on right now. The first one is to build a zero-touch certificate authority so that we can ensure that all communication inside the Kubernetes deployment is as secure as possible. The second thing that we're working on is integrating Azure Kubernetes Service for Azure Stack HCI into your existing Active Directory environment. And we're doing this both for access to Azure Kubernetes Service itself, but also for your containerized applications that are running on top of the platform. Finally, you get the benefit of being integrated into the Microsoft security ecosystem. We've done a lot of work to ensure that Azure Stack HCI is an incredibly secure platform for running anything on top of, and Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI gets to take advantage of that. We're also actively working on doing integration with our Azure-based offerings like Azure Security Center. So moving on, when would you use Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI? Well, there are really three large scenarios that we think about. The first one is for all of you that have Windows applications that you're trying to modernize and move to be more cloud native. The second one, of course, is for anyone who's wanting to build new cloud native apps that they need to run in a hybrid world. And the third one is to run a new wave of Microsoft hybrid offerings that are coming to market. And for this last one, let me go over to Carmen, who's going to demonstrate Arc-enabled data services running on Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, folks. My name is Carmen Crincoli, and I'm one of the hundreds of Microsoft PMs whose home offices you get to enjoy this week during Ignite. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's dive in. I'm going to deploy Azure Arc-enabled data services onto my freshly created AKS on HCI target cluster. The tool I'm going to be using is Azure Data Studio. The beautiful thing about using Data Studio for this is it allows people like data specialists to deploy to Kubernetes and other infrastructure without requiring them to become experts on YAML or new command lines. When I choose to deploy, I'm presented with the option for creating an Arc data controller. Because I put the config file for my target cluster into my user profile already, it's just picked up. I choose the type of Kubernetes cluster I'm targeting, provide some additional info, and ADS takes care of the rest. It ends up generating a Jupyter notebook that has all of that data plugged into it, plus all the script you need to get the controller installed. I just hit run all, sit back, and let it do the work. Once that's done, I can connect ADS to my newly deployed data controller and start deploying SQL or Postgres instances as needed. This is even easier because the Arc data controller does all the hard work. All I need to do is name the instance, provide a password, and select a storage class for the data files and log files, and then hit deploy. In less than a minute, I have a newly deployed SQL instance and can connect to it just like any other. Now for the best part, since this is an Azure Arc-enabled service, all of these SQL instances show up in the Azure portal just like any other managed instance. This gives you access to powerful cloud-native tools like Azure Monitor and Analytics. Having one place to view and manage all your resources, even on-prem, really shows the power of Microsoft's hybrid Azure services. Back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Carmen. I love how in that demo, it really felt like you were running Azure Data Services, but in reality, it was all running on Azure Stack HCI in your environment. It's really cool to see. And just clicking in here to highlight the power of what we've just shown. So what we're saying is that you can have an end-to-end solution where you have Azure Stack HCI running on validated hardware from one of our partners. On top of that, you have Azure Kubernetes Service. And on top of that, you can then have offerings from Microsoft like Arc-enabled data services and your own applications. So it is really everything that you need for hybrid cloud in your environment, all in a single place with a consistent, easy to manage environment, which is really exciting to see coming to market. So with all of this said, let's just spend a little moment talking about architecture. Not as long as I would love to. Hopefully we'll have more time to talk about architecture in detail in the future. But at a super high level, the architecture looks like this. At the bottom, you have Azure Stack HCI running on top of hardware in your environment. On top of that, we have a set of virtual machines that are all automatically updated and fully managed for you. Then that works in combination with a number of open source projects that Microsoft has been creating and contributing to enable Kubernetes to work well in this environment. We have integration for storage, for networking, integration with Azure Stack HCI itself. And then on top of that, of course, we have the Kubernetes offering itself, which is all utilizing the open source components that are out there. And then finally, right at the top, we have Azure Arc. That brings us all together and gives you the real power of the Azure hybrid offering. Now you know all about Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI, both what it is, when you should be using it, and how it comes in and helps complete our Azure hybrid story for containerized workloads. But what now? Well, I'm excited to say that Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI is in public preview. So I really hope that after watching this, you go and register for the public preview so that we can send you the details on how to download it and you can get up and running using the documentation that we have provided. I'm really excited to see both what people do with Azure Kubernetes Service on Azure Stack HCI and to hear from all of you so that we can help define the direction and grow it into being an amazing platform for running your applications in the future. So here are a set of resources that you can look at, links to our product page, our announcement blog, where you can get the preview, and our documentation. And I really look forward to seeing you all online as you're providing feedback. Thank you all for your time today.